I've got the unenviable task of going last at the end of a long forum, so I'll try and keep it upbeat and snappy. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the talks today, and particularly Sean's point has brought up a lot of questions for me in terms of an AGL campaign, which is actually targeting a corporation. They're Australia's biggest energy provider, but interestingly, they're also the biggest owner of renewables. And so I think there is a big question there for the environment movement about, if we are talking about, and some of the questions for this forum around switching Australia to clean energy, are we just switching them to corporate-owned clean energy? And to be honest, I don't think, even now that's raising questions for my mind, because I don't think as an environment movement we've tackled that at all well, let alone started discussing it. And so I'm really keen to read the paper Resist, Reclaim and Restructure, because I think right now, particularly for 350.org, we're an organisation, fairly small, grassroots, we have about 10 staff in Australia. We're pretty much focused on resisting. We're in the resist phase in terms of stopping some of the biggest fossil fuel projects in Australia, but I am really interested to think about that next step in terms of the reclaiming and restructuring. And there are moves. I'll talk a bit in a sec about the divestment movement, and that has been shifting money away from fossil fuels, but we are starting to look to, develop reinvestment principles, and some of those are around redistributing the power. So where does that money go once it's divested? But those conversations are really in the early days. And so what I'm really talking to mostly is a bit of a perspective from, my time up in Mackay, which is a big mining town in Queensland, and reflections around community organising and around justice and what that means as we, propose some big campaigns to switch us to clean energy. But then also post-election, this is a post-election forum, we have a new government. What are the key challenges and some key opportunities I see in terms of building a grassroots climate justice movement? I mean, I think there was some polling to indicate that even though climate, awareness and desire for climate action was higher at this federal election than it was at the last federal election. So we are having an increasing awareness around climate, but it was totally not on the political agenda. So I think that raises some real key questions for us as a climate movement. When I moved to Mackay 2.5 years ago, it was pretty much right at the end of the mining boom. When I first started there, I was looking for a share house. It was about $250 for a room in a share house in a town of 50,000 people, which is sort of Sydney prices. I was quite shocked. And when I left there about 6 months ago, housing prices had plummeted. About 10,000 people had left the region. We could get an entire 3-bedroom house for $200 a week. And, that was in the space of 18 months. That change had occurred. And, we're in the crazy position of rental real estate agents hounding you rather than the other way around, to try and get these rental properties. So I think one of the key messages I have is the transition isn't something in the future. This is happening right now, and it's having a real big social impact, particularly on communities right across Queensland in the Bowen Basin, where large mines are shedding hundreds and hundreds of jobs. And I think, for me, that question of environmental justice, climate justice, maybe there's sort of 3 levels to that. There's sort of the international level, the desire for climate action to make sure we're addressing a problem that's impacting the world's most poor and vulnerable, they didn't cause. At the national level, maybe we're touching on some of the ideas that Sean presented around energy democracy. But at the local level, we're thinking about how, for those communities like those ones in Mackay and surrounds, that we can support communities to transition away from coal. And I think, if we're thinking about lessons for the environment movement, the climate movement around this idea of just transition, I think we have failed to adequately engage those communities, and not just recognising the moral and the ethical reasons to be supporting, say, communities to transition away from coal, but also the strategic value of doing it. I think, from living and working with communities in places like Bowen, where there was a proposed expansion of the Abbott Point coal terminal, those communities were really just crying out for jobs and trying to get those projects up as their belief was that it was the only way it could deliver jobs. And I think we've really failed to engage those communities, and it's only really that call from the regions in marginal electorates that has been driving political support for those coal projects. I think if we were in a position where we'd spend a lot more time organising in communities, building the support for a transition, that would actually diminish the power of that political support for coal. So I think that's a failing. It's something we need to think about, and it's particularly a key challenge as we go forward with timelines creeping up on us. You know, if we're honest, we're already within the critical decade of climate change. We have less than 10 years to totally get off fossil fuels, and I think there's a challenge there with how we organise and campaign in those timeframes in a way that supports those communities to transition. I think another, maybe a failure, but something that Mark's touched on. Clearly, we've got an immensely powerful opposition in the fossil fuel industry, and Mark's just touched on the tip of the iceberg of how that is. But I think we need to start being honest and more directly confronting the power of our enemies. And I think the way 350 has tried to do that is partly through the divestment movement. So that's a movement that, you know, we are engaged with, but definitely certainly aren't involved in all the campaigns that are run. It's a way where there's institutions and organisations that have been shifting money out of fossil fuels. We now have, I think, over 500 institutions divested and a couple of $1 trillion shifted away from fossil fuels. And that comes from really, I think, you know, people are fed up with asking politicians to do the right thing. You know, I think there's other ways, challenging like directly the finances behind these projects that, one, are more engaging and are starting to become more effective in both shifting the money, one of the pillars of support for the industry, but also the social licenses that industry has. And so Amy touched on it earlier, but the campaign to get the funding or 14 international and domestic banks to pull out of the Galilee Basin campaign was really a collaborative effort, and it, you know, comes from a theory of change that, you know, we weren't going to spend the time calling on the government to end this project. We actually had to directly pull the finances out of that project to be successful, and I think that's something that as a movement we're starting really to do a lot better. Yeah, I guess, so where are we now? We're at a stage where I think particularly people that have been in this movement for a long time are becoming increasingly desperate with the climate impacts we're starting to see, particularly up in Queensland. We've had the worst bleaching event ever. We have, you know, a quarter of the reef is dead. It's surprising that, you know, although that got a lot of media attention, that hasn't sparked more outrage. It certainly sparked outrage up in Cairns. We've had community groups popping up all over the place, increasingly calling and doing civil disobedience in response to these moments. But certainly it's not getting the attention it should. And secondly, we have a challenge of a parliament, a Turnbull government that has almost no plan for climate change action, our Senate that is going to be obstructive to climate action, and essentially a situation where I can't see any kind of climate legislation coming out of Parliament in the next 3 years. And so I think if we're honest about that situation, and even if we got some measly sort of piecemeal legislation, we know right now that neither party is supporting a policy that is you know, in line with the scale that we need. And so I think, you know, now is a critical time in our movement to reflect on that point. We have less than 10 years to shift off fossil fuels to a clean energy economy. We clearly have a government that has no plan to do that in the next 3 years. And so I guess I'd like to touch on, you know, what are the opportunities that come around that situation where we face now. And one of them is in looking to state government. I think, you know, the campaign that was run around ACT and renewable energy to get them, they've got an amazingly successful 100% renewable by 2020 target that they're actually ahead of the game on. In Queensland, we actually have quite an ambitious renewable energy target of 50% renewables by 2030, I think. But we need to build a public campaign to actually start hitting those targets. Often these targets are on the table. There's no actual timeline or, basically in Queensland, and if we want to meet 100% renewable energy nationally, we actually have to start closing some coal-fired power stations, and there's no targets or timelines on the table around doing that. Although there was talk of it in the lead up to the federal election from Labor, which is encouraging. So I think there are some opportunities at the state level. I think where 350's, focus and probably the strengths of our networks lies is really in, focusing on those other forms of power, not electoral power and shifting votes, but consumer power. And for example, in Australia, the banks, pretty much the big four banks underwrite most of the fossil fuel projects in Australia, and groups like Market Forces are starting to ramp up campaigns really to hold them accountable to some commitments they've got around committing to a 2-degree global warming target. Jeff mentioned we've got a campaign taking on Australia's biggest climate polluter, which is AGL Energy. They own 3 coal-fired power stations. They have a plan to close those power stations by 2050. That's 3 more decades of climate pollution. If they're serious about acting on climate, we need those power stations shut down in 10 years. And AGL, they're a retail company. They care about what customers and shareholders think. They have about 4 million customers in Australia. Pretty much everyone in this room would indirectly have shares in AGL through their super funds. So our sort of strategy around AGL is engaging customers, shareholders to build consumer power, calling on AGL to close their power stations in a timeline that matches the climate science. That's sort of where we're headed next in terms of the national campaign. But I also think something I've been thinking more about is in how we actually do respond to these worsening climate impacts and the tipping points we're starting to see. I sort of mentioned the reef bleaching, which is absolutely devastating. But I think there are other examples where, moments have produced, high energy or kick-started a campaign. So, for example, in Morwell in the Latrobe Valley, there was a massive mine fire that burned for many, many days and caused basically a health crisis. And that really has kicked off a group called Voices of the Valley, calling for transition away from coal, not just for to get long-term sustainable jobs, but for the health reasons. Similarly, when I was working in Virginia, there was an example of a fly ash spill at a coal plant where, people, it really, those kind of moments spark energy in people's minds. And I think there's an opportunity there for us to go in and organise and harness that energy in response to what we know will become, increasing climate impact moments. So, there's a few of us, I've been reading a book called This Is an Uprising. Is anyone reading that? All right, Isabel. I think, it sparked some really key ideas that I've been thinking about. It's not something escalation, yeah. But there's an idea about momentum-driven organising, and the basic concept is that throughout history we've had major uprisings, through, say, the civil rights movement, or through the Serbian movement to get rid of Milosevic. And those uprisings aren't always just a response to a political context. In some cases, they are organised by people for many years beforehand, and they often happen in response to trigger moments. So trigger moments being, there's a definition in the book of being a highly publicised, shocking incident that dramatically reveals a critical social problem to the public in a vivid way. And I think what we're going to see with climate change is increasing storms, increasing floods, increasing human and essentially human loss of life that we need to be ready to respond to and organise those communities, not just to be resilient and to provide relief, but also to become political and build a movement for action. I think, that isn't easy. One of the things I'm interested in, there was actually a group called Occupy Sandy in response to the hurricane in New York. It was just happened after Occupy New York, and the organisers that were doing the Occupy movement actually ended up going into that community and doing a lot of the work, actually rebuilding the community. And because they built up strong community networks through the Occupy campaign, they were actually more efficient at delivering resources to those communities in response. So they set up a network of churches that were delivering, emergency supplies, and the government ended up actually giving that campaign or that organisation money to do it for them. And I think, and 4 years later, they've actually set up, an organisation which is built on things like workers' cooperatives, that has really started to shift or redistribute the power around, making those communities more resilient in the face of the next climate induced crisis, and then also addresses all the social issues and starts to redistribute that power. How are we going for time?
I think it's about time.
We're about time. So that's something I'm really excited about, is how we do escalate. I think civil disobedience and disruption of the status quo are key parts of it, and something that Lock the Gate in particular does really well. I think time's running out, and we need to start thinking about how we're going to harness and build and organising communities that are going to be most hardest hit by some of these climate-induced impacts.
We want to make sure we've got time to talk amongst each other to come up with a few gems of ideas. But we will get all your ideas on pieces of paper, and we'll Environmental Justice Committee, which I'm sure we'd welcome anybody who's interested in joining, could work through some of those ideas and work out the next steps. I mean, there's so much there. We could be talking all night. But if you've got a few questions to Moira, now is the time.
Just a few problems which seem to arise when we're talking about just transitions. It was mentioned that we use the language of just transitions, but not necessarily always providing understanding concretely what just transitions means. It's like, one question is, often tactics that environmental protesters will use, for example, like lock-ons or something like that, will directly stop a project from going ahead. That sort of tactic will often necessarily put workers offside. Are those tactics we can continue to engage in while also trying to engage in meaningful, say, discourse around just transitions? And one other question is to do with wages. So supposedly a just transition is meant to mean that the next job that you'll get has similar level of wages or quality of life and what have you. In mining in Australia, wages are often over $100,000 a year or something, and I don't know that it's reasonably practicable that we are going to be able to provide jobs for all these workers in the same level of, say, over $100,000 a year. So do we actually need to be talking to workers about, hey, we're going to need you to take a wage cut?
Mining companies right now in the Bowen Basin are saying you might have to take a wage cut and share your wage with your buddy if you don't want to have job cuts. So I think, the reality is people are losing their jobs now, and not through any fault of the environment. That's because of the massive slumps in the coal price. So I think that question's a really interesting one. I mean, the other one you raised around, I guess the role of civil disobedience at particular sites of infrastructure where the workers are. I think it's a really key one. I don't think it's one that we've talked about enough. But for example, in the AGL campaign, AGL own Liddell Power Station in the Hunter Valley. That's scheduled to close in 2022. We think in terms of a climate perspective, it should go within the next couple of years. And I think in terms of calling for a just transition, we're also calling for these companies to be upfront around their timelines for coal closure. So one of the things we saw with the Port Augusta plant in South Australia is the company saying, well, it's going to close in 3 years. Oh, actually now it's going to close in 6 months with no planning for closure. So I think certainly 350 will be, I think, looking to escalate around the issue of coal closure and using civil disobedience as part of that. What that looks like, we're not too sure yet. But I think also in the framing around that is, this government is not planning for the closure of coal-fired power stations, and that's disruptive to those communities, and those companies aren't being honest about the real timelines for closure.
I want to ask what the community feeling now is about the Abbott Point campaign and the whole Adani and Galilee, given the crashes. The crash has happened. It hasn't been caused by our campaign yet. So I hope it's a different scene. And also, I think just to comment on your election assessment. The way I see it, we've got a government that's sort of struggling to stand on its feet, and maybe we don't have 3 years of this government in front of us, which is it's a climate denying government and all that. So the opportunities might be campaigns which will bring the government down, and maybe the Adani or one of these is one of them. It's renewable energy was there in the election, but it wasn't in the end. Medicare was the election issue, but it's still there, I think, in the thinking, and I think we've got a good situation to press forward with that type of agenda from our movement.
That's maybe something some other environmental orgs will work on. I mean, certainly in our view is, even if you got rid of Libs, you get Labor in, and that's not going to, again, deliver this timescale. We've seen Labor fail on climate, and so certainly won't be a strategy that 350 is focusing on, but I think definitely it's a good strategy for some other environmental organisations to focus on. The community feeling up north is, I think there's a federal politician up there that is hanging on to Abbott Point, George Christensen, there's no other option. There's very still, it's very actually disappointing to see politicians push something so hard, which they know is actually by the day is less and less likely to go ahead. I think the community are cottoning on to that. They know it's not going to deliver 10,000 jobs like they get told. It's less and less jobs. The majority of those jobs are fly-in, fly-out workers, and I think there's an increasing realisation that it won't go ahead. But certainly it's a quite divisive issue.
Thanks, Moira. Thanks for that. And I was particularly taken by something you said, which was that the whole struggle that we're engaged in is a historic struggle. It's not just a campaign. I often think we underestimate the kind of change and challenge that we're offering to this society and what it requires. Because if you're engaged in a historic struggle, you need to think about the means by which you'll do it. And at the moment, there seems to be a kind of alternative between activist actions which require a high degree of commitment by a small number of people on one hand, and then a kind of marketing campaigns by big environmental NGOs on the other, as, if you like, two ends of the spectrum. And it seems to me often there's no room for ordinary people with jobs to take part in a participatory action appropriate to fighting for a historical change. Given, as people have mentioned, and as we all know, we're talking about a climate emergency where leading figures are even talking about catastrophic consequences. Shouldn't we be paying more attention to the kind of strategy needed for such a historic challenge?
When there are big uprisings, I think the challenge with climate, as opposed to, say, a Bentley moment where there's a direct threat to people, is a really big one. We need to create the crisis around climate, and that is really difficult to do because often those uprisings happen when people are directly oppressed. It's very difficult to kind of create that crisis moment. But the book talks about when you do create them and you get mass momentum and energy, that brings people in all different kinds of ways you couldn't have imagined when you were just doing the nitty-gritty organising work and by one and one people bring people into the movement. So I think it's a huge challenge. I think we need to create a crisis. Not sure I have all the answers on how to do that, but I think you've raised a good challenge.
Thank you. Jackie's going to go around and she's going to give each of you a piece of paper, or if you've got one already, if you've got a pen, use that. What we want to, obviously everybody needs to have a chance to have a say.
Sustainability doesn't energy is not so we need strategies
in the field of energy democracy to inform and work with other environmental and not necessarily just environmental organisations to inform broader strategy in how we can deal with the issue.
forum where there's a discussion between all of the environmental groups that raise those things about democracy, environmental democracy, as opposed to sustainability, not as opposed to, as well as sustainability, and call it power to the people.
Yeah, we had a few, but I think the one we come up with was the need to break the consensus on market-based solutions, to propose social alternatives to the ETS in particular.
Yeah.
One of the most important ones was the need for breadth in campaigning and cutting across political divisions, and that came out of what Vicky was saying, and the way that you need to work broadly and not narrowly.
We have to work at the local level, and as hard as it is to knock on your neighbour's door and talk to them. I think it is hard work, but that's really what's involved, what we've got to do. Local level, find an issue, unify people.
Actually, I don't think we're able to get Sean back on.
it's not working.
Well, sorry about that, Sean. Perhaps you might like to send us something in writing, even via email, if you have the time, and I'm sure you're very busy after what you've heard, and it would be really excellent if we could put that into our environmental justice discussion bulletin, which we're hoping to produce within the next fortnight, if not month. We're aiming for a fortnight, but we're realists. But anything that you could send us that you think would be useful for our environmental justice bulletin would be very helpful and informative for all of us, including any reflections you might have as a result of what you've heard from the panellists. And I think officially we'd just like to thank you for being part of this forum. I'm sure we'd all like to thank all the panellists for the excellent there's such an amazing breadth of experience and angles in this struggle for a just and climate-safe world that we heard from all the panellists, from the grassroots, from the research and policy area like Mark, the work that Moira and Amy and everybody really is doing together, and hopefully we can make a contribution. I think the ideas that we got from you just now, if we're able to do anything about any of them, let alone all of them, together, that would be fantastic. And I'm not sure if you know, but this forum was organised by a working group of Search, which is called the Environmental Justice Working Group. We meet via phone or face-to-face. I'm via phone because I'm in Newcastle. Some are in Brisbane. People like Drew Hutton are involved in it. Others, we meet via phone and face-to-face about once a month. And if you're interested in helping, if you're a member of Search, then I'm sure we'd welcome more people to share the work around because, obviously the more people involved, the more we can do together. So if you don't mind, as I said, it feels a bit like school sometimes, but if you could pass your notes to us, then that gives us something to work with, some documents from the meeting, and we can look at them and think, okay, what can we do realistically within our limitations to move this work forward on behalf of Search and with other people.